Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Power to the People. This week, John, we're going to be diving into a lot of things having to do with kind of how the energy industry can survive kind of going forward. I think it's just an interesting look at how the technology, the industry, and the economics have developed. And I think one of the things that I wanted to set the conversation for the audience is that as we have this conversation, a lot of this is based on time. And it's like some of the, I try and equate it also to like, look at the computers that we have nowadays. Literally a computer in your pocket, a phone. If you told anybody that even probably 20 years ago that would be a reality, it would be like, oh, no way. 40 years ago, they were, the size of, they were huge. And people were like, no, there's no way it's going to get to be small. And here we are. And was there some waste along the way? Absolutely. Were there some bad decisions along the way? Absolutely. However, it also paved the way and learning the lessons and to kind of always have that learner's mindset that now we have so much capability built into these products, for better, for worse, but that really changed the world. And so I encourage everyone that is listening to kind of look at what we're discussing today in the context of a longer timeline, not necessarily just this point in time. So anyway, just wanted to set that point of the conversation, but John, would love to just dive in first on, the tax credit side of things. I think is a very interesting thing. That is a little bit more of a now time thing. That tax credits are kind of going away in the energy industry, mainly on the renewable side. And how do you address that? I think the first question that people have is like, is it even worth it anymore?
Yeah, that is a big question. And yes, I mean, the technology is still worth it. Trying to jump through all the hoops that they've created to get the tax credits, maybe not so much. And this is all kind of centered around the big question, like that is rooted in history. So thank you for setting it off with that context. Can clean energy survive without federal tax credits? Because the evolution, the development of clean energy, of renewables, and batteries too, to a lesser extent, has been really driven by federal tax credits. And there's been a lot of other factors, obviously, that go into play there, but the federal tax credits have been this kind of consistent driving force for the most of the time that renewables have really been taking off. So now the question is, like, can renewables stand on their own 2 feet? And I think yes. And we'll go through all the reasons why I think that today. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the point of the tax credits, which was to drive technological development, increase access, and lower costs of the technology, have those all have been largely accomplished. So the technology is the cheapest out of anything. It has the most access available to it, in terms of the average person, the average business, the average investor. Like it's the easiest thing to invest in, and it's kind of got this incredible technological development history. From things that just barely captured, solar panels that barely captured any sunlight, to highly efficient ones that we have now, to even things in the future that we can see on the horizon, that really, that's kind of a unique thing to renewable technologies, is like, there's so much more potential for future growth, as opposed to like a diesel engine is kind of like, we've kind of just maxed out that technology. So those are things to keep in mind. Like, yeah, basically the point of the tax credits has been accomplished. So the off ramp that was originally provided by the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which extended these tax credits out into the 2030s, that obviously would have provided a smoother transition away from government subsidies, from relying on the tax credits, with the added benefit that was unfortunately taken away, that would have bolstered domestic manufacturing capabilities. So the IRA, it set up this, the kind of a carrot and the stick thing, for domestic manufacturing, where the stick was, the increased fees on, imported panels and things like that, while also providing carrots to, make it easier for U.S. based companies to, develop their own products. So
Well, and
that,
it's also really interesting, like from the standpoint of pretty much anything that we use day to day now, more or less did rely on some sort of incentive, whether that be a tax advantage, whether that be a grant structure, whether that be investment from key players. It was like there's always like an injection of capital, that, and depending on the source of that, in order to drive that innovation. Because I mean, if you step back for a second, you're like, okay, what if we created this company from scratch? The amount of money and risk and everything involved, even if the benefit is significantly outweighing it, that's an extremely hard hurdle just to get the finance side and to get it out to the market to even see if it's viable. And so I think also looking at this as every industry kind of has needed this to kind of get there. And then there's that moment of like, all right, time to leave the nest.
yeah, yeah. And renewables were something that we kind of collectively, through our elected representatives, recognized as something that we needed to develop more quickly than it was like, otherwise going to happen, which was the point of the tax credits, was to help accelerate that development process. It would have happened anyway, because the technology is just like on a fundamental, like theoretical level, it just works better. It makes more sense than what we've been using. So all that being said, we won't have that as smooth of a transition, but that doesn't mean that renewables aren't going to stand on their own feet. So one of the things that I think is kind of exciting about this, and like with a little bit of like anticipation, but solar is going to be, once these tax credits end, and in more than one way, really kind of the most honest source of energy in the country, as in the one that is standing most on its own feet, on its own merits. Because coal and nuclear are now getting huge direct subsidies, as are natural and gas through incentives for things like carbon capture and storage capabilities. So now all the the old, rather bad faith arguments against solar and wind that were based in their need for government subsidies to develop the technology in the market more quickly, those arguments can now be turned against these so-called conventional generation sources. We'll be using that term a lot today, but with extra teeth now, because we know for a fact that these sources have much less potential for growth, and they have huge drawbacks and costs that renewables, which are a perfectly viable, suite of technologies, just do not have and will not have.
I kind of try to always think about like the positive in this. If we are like, hey, renewables are going to be the way of the future, this electrification is going to make sense. Like, I feel like everybody's starting to come around to that idea. It couldn't also be propping up an older industry in order to ease that transition, so it's not just like a cliff drop off for all of those people, all of those jobs, all of that infrastructure. Like, they will inevitably have to shift just with technology and truly the economics just making sense. And I like to believe that it's like easing that like drop off a cliff moment for that older industry to give people an on ramp, because I think like a sudden stop in that is jarring to homes, economies, workers, people who've committed their entire lives to learning a craft that is suddenly like completely different. I think that's also, I like to believe that that's part of it, but that could just be my positive mindset.
Commendable optimism.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely crucial to do that. We
Mhm.
should not leave people behind. We should not have sacrificial populations. If you really want to support like the workers in a time of transition, you provide them with training programs. You provide them with, maybe a guaranteed income while they're going through these, the new education. You provide, like money for relocation to where like, new jobs are. And, you provide incentives for these communities to make it easier for, communities that are most hard hit to be more self-sustaining, more self-sufficient. With all this going on, and renewable energy is like, you can just go and look at the numbers and see that it is both the lowest cost energy source in the country and the quickest to deploy. And this business Lizards, it's like lizards but with an extra A. They have built up a really stellar reputation as a trusted group that studies and presents information on what's called the levelized cost of energy. It's got an acronym, but I'm not going to bore you with that.
Another acronym.
You can figure it out. But basically, that's like taking the whole like life cycle of of an energy source into consideration. How much does it cost, like on a megawatt hour basis? And they have a bunch of great graphics and visualizations of all these data that I am going to share to illustrate some important points. So let me get my share thing going here. So let's start with kind of the basic one, which is the levelized cost of energy. Kind of the basic thing that they study. So the this graph is split into like two halves. There's the bigger upper half, which is all of the renewable types of generation, and then there's the kind of the gray blue section at the bottom, which is the conventional generation. So we've got solar on the top with like community, so residential and commercial and industrial solar, solar utility scale solar, utility scale solar plus storage, geothermal, etc. And then for the conventional generation, we have gas peaking, which are those natural gas peaker plants that we've talked about before, which we use to basically keep the grid from collapsing when energy demand is at its very highest. So those are, crucial to maintain grid stability in the current like paradigm that we have right now. Then we have nuclear, coal, and gas combined cycle. So that's basically just a more efficient type of natural gas generation. So we can see quite clearly on this graph that the lowest cost energy sources are utility scale solar and onshore wind. So those are, if you go to the very left, we've got solar PV starting at $38 and then onshore wind starting at $37. And those are the cheapest, like across the board. Of course, the price, there is a price range because that's just how things work. And the tighter the range, the more consistent those costs are. So like utility scale solar has a very narrow range because it's, we've really got that dialed in. Community and commercial and industrial solar, that very top bar, that's got a really big range because it's a lot harder to tap into the same economies of scale for, smaller community-based projects versus like huge utility scale ones. So there is just naturally, this larger range and higher costs, but they also come with more benefits and more value potential than what is captured here. So just something to keep in mind as we talk about that. Like, yeah, that price for community and commercial and industrial solar looks pretty high, but there are some hidden benefits in there, in terms of resiliency, in terms of new opportunities for revenue creation, things like that. So, and it's also really the sole form of generation on this chart that's available for investment in by the general public. So like, as a homeowner, as a business owner, you can go out and you can invest in, rooftop solar pretty easily. Much harder to invest in utility scale solar or in a nuclear power plant. That those aren't things that are really available or accessible to the average person. So that's another, little point in the pros column for the commercial and industrial solar. So something else really cool that you can see here in this chart is that by adding energy storage to renewable generation sources, yes, you are potentially increasing the overall cost of the project, but there are still big overlaps between the prices of renewable projects with and without solar. So if you look at the solar utility and then the one right below it, the solar utility plus storage, there's still a good bit of overlap between those two bars, and those are the price ranges where solar and storage and solar alone are competitive with each other. And what that says to me is that there's a huge opportunity now for going back to renewable projects that were built before energy storage became so economical and adding batteries to them, which would provide knock-on benefits for the grid, for the utilities, and for us as ratepayers. Because there are many instances where adding storage to a project not only provides benefits like load shaping capabilities and buy low, sell high energy market participation, but that where that levelized cost of energy is basically the same as without it. So there's really like a huge potential, I think, for new investments in storage.
Well, and that's what they don't talk about enough, I don't think, when it comes to I think the advantage, but also the potential of battery storage is like that buy low, sell high. I mean, you look at how people trade stocks and that's, wealth appreciation outside. You now can actually do that with energy, which is so wildly interesting. And it's not trading the price of oil. It's not trading the price of a commodity. It is literally the thing itself, to actually own that power and to own that energy and to be able to circulate that in the market. That is a completely separate way of thinking about energy that I think has never been able to be done before. Because even if you wanted to provide energy on the old school way of doing it, you still have to produce that power. Solar panels are already producing that power, and the fact that you can then store it, that is a stored asset that's ready to be offloaded for either usage or profitability or both. And I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind when you go through this, is like truly that knock-on benefit that you can get through a lot of these other generation methods.
Yeah. It's not just you build it and you get your ROI like a utility scale or a natural gas peaker plant. It's this whole new world of of opportunities that that provide a lot of benefits. So moving on to the next one. This graph shows this is kind of the heart of this conversation. This shows the sensitivity of renewable energy sources to U.S. federal tax subsidies. So the ITC, the tax credit. This one is crucial to understand for why cutting the tax credit will not be the end of renewables. So what we're looking at here is any place where the blue and gray bars. So the blue bars are showing the cost without the tax credits, and then the gray bars are showing the cost with the tax credits. So you can see that the gray bars are usually a little shifted to the left, meaning they're a little lower price. But the key thing is that there's still a ton of overlap between the blue bars and the gray bars. And that overlap, it's usually like, I mean, you can kind of just roughly go through. It's like somewhere between like 70 to 90% is overlap, which means that, maybe 10 to 30% of projects may become economically infeasible due to the lack of tax credits, which is not, it's not perfect. It's not, super great, but it's not quite the world ending, tragedy that I think many people have kind of built it up to be. The sky is not falling. It's just becoming just a little more expensive. So it is becoming a little more expensive, but there's still going to be, the large majority of projects that make sense today will still make sense in 2 years and in 3 years. And really even kind of more so because the added values that are unique to renewables, especially distributed ones like rooftop solar and non-utility battery storage, those will continue to grow. And as more batteries come online, they become more valuable, the ones that are already in place, because there's more opportunities for participation in, something like a virtual power plant. So once you take those factors into account, the economics look even better, because these numbers aren't taking into account like virtual power plant participation. They're not taking into account, avoided costs from power outages, from the enhanced resiliency. They're not taking into account, the buy low, sell high capabilities of battery storage. So once you factor those things in, the economics look even better. But even without them, even just what's shown on this table, on this graph, I think it can help assuage a lot of the fears about the outlook of the renewable industry. So.
Well, and to go back, like even to the beginning of the conversation where we talked about that advancement of computers, the technology is only improving. So that cost, the economies of scale will continue to make sense because those costs will continue to go down. The efficiency will continue to go up as it always has year over year. Like whether it be solar panel efficiency, battery efficiency, transmission efficiency, like all of those things have improved and they're going to continue to improve, but also I think we're moving out of that stage of I am an early adopter of renewables. And now it's like they call it first mover advantage. Now it's the advantage stage. Like if you move into this sector now, it's about to really hit that inflection point. Everybody knows that if you hit that inflection point and you're kind of first there, you reap the most benefits. And so a lot of this is like, now I think the timing is perfect. So as much as it's unfortunate that the tax credits have gone away, it's also a big light that says, hey, now is the time actually, because if you invest now, the benefits are only going to continue. Because if you kind of hop on the train a lot longer, your return is still going to be there, unlike the traditional methods of generation, storage, and or distribution. But it'll be at a lesser rate than if you adopted it sooner. And so I think a lot of the people are even like, hey, we should wait a little bit longer. Man, what if, solid state and all this stuff, all that stuff's going to come online anyway. But in order to have that infrastructure set up and going, you're already going to be reaping the benefits and it's already just going to be better.
Yeah. There's always a cost of not taking action too. It's so in that the compromise calculation, you have to take into account like, yes, there's going to be a lot of future growth. There's going to be a lot of future development. And, one kind of unexpected side effect of ending the tax credit is that it's effectively going to depoliticize clean energy, which thank God, it's about time. It should never have been politicized in the first place. Doesn't make any sense, because it's like we keep saying, it's just better technology. It's just a better way to do what we have already been doing. That gives us more opportunities. That gives us a brighter future. It just across the board, depoliticizing clean energy, I think is going to be a major strength for it. So going back on a little bit of a darker note to this graph, so you talked about wanting or like the need to support communities in transitioning away from the fossil fuel paradigm, and this graph shows what the effects of the particular way in which they've ended the solar federal tax credits or the renewable federal tax credits. So on the far left side of the gray bars, there's a little stripy tail. What that shows is the tax credits that have been going to energy communities, which are, it's kind of the federal term for low income and disadvantaged communities that have been, kind of hardest hit by our economic models and, the way in which we, cite our energy infrastructure and, things like that. And also areas that have been most economically impacted by the transition away from fossil fuels, places like coal towns. There's a lot of energy communities in the United States are like former coal towns. And by taking away the tax credits for these communities, so the energy community tax credits are like the most valuable type of tax credits. So by taking away these like the highest value tax credits, which are going to the people that need them the most, the government is essentially blocking these communities from easily going renewable, which if it's not easy, it means it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So, which means that the most vulnerable people in the country, the people that have kind of carried this energy, the energy paradigm on their backs, they're going to be forced to have higher energy costs, higher levels of pollution, and less economic opportunities, which is an outcome I think we can safely and firmly put in the antisocial side of the overall impact spectrum for perpetuating sacrificial populations. That's just one of the, for me, it's one of the fundamental tenets of an antisocial, behavior is, are you creating sacrificial populations? And this, unfortunately, is. So I think the faster the industry develops and the more people get involved, the lower these costs are going to be, and the lower the impact we can make or we can have for these vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. So
there's also a lot of I will say and you're spot on, by the way. Like that is something that it does affect those communities, and we need to be able to have that on ramp, like we discussed earlier, of like education and opportunities and training and everything. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, at Mint, we're part of the IBEW. And it's like, because part of that is also giving that on ramp of like, if this is the new future, like, let's bring electrical workers to the forefront. Like, these are the people that are building the projects, that they have been building traditional electrical systems, and these are the newer ones. Like, it's providing the education, the on ramp, the pay, the support, like really leveraging this into the future. And that's part of the reason why we did that, is because like it needs to be a truly lift everybody effort, rather than just we're going to go this way and kind of forget the rest. And I think that's one of the big things I think we're proud of, at least internally, but also I think it's a market wide push to be like, look, we're not trying to leave anybody behind. We're just trying to bring everybody with us, and we're trying to find the best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you look around the economy right now, you see what happens when you treat your workers like dirt. You see what happens when you treat the people that are like actually doing the stuff that makes the economy go, when you treat them like they're disposable and replaceable. Like it doesn't have good outcomes. It has antisocial outcomes. So supporting union labor, supporting livable wages, supporting training programs, education, like those things are all really pro-social. Like, because they make a better outcome for everybody. It's better for the workers, it's better for the customers, it's better for developers. To have high quality work that you really can't get if you don't pay your workers enough. Where they're living on SNAP. Which is like SNAP is basically, it's a government subsidy for corporations to pay poverty level wages. Like there's it's so. Yes, it is a great thing. It's very pro-social, unions, union labor. Yeah. So, anyway, so the next graph, okay, there we go, is showing the sensitivity to fuel prices for conventional generation technologies. So there's not anything really going on the renewable top half of the graph, because the fuel for renewable technologies is free and it's everywhere. So there is no sensitivity to fuel prices, which is just, naturally a huge benefit, obviously, to renewables. But taking a look at that conventional generation side of things, we can see that the variability, which are kind of the lighter blue ends, so the variability attributed to fuel prices, to changing fuel prices, is actually roughly on par to what we saw by taking away the 30% tax credit for renewables. So as fossil fuel prices naturally fluctuate and grow over time because they're a finite resource, generation sources that rely on them will see about the same impact than what renewables will see due to the ITC ending, and likely even larger impacts in the long term. So, and this, just to reiterate, this is something that renewables will never have to worry about until, somebody figures out how to monetize the sun. So yeah, so this demonstrates the important point that renewables are not only cheaper than conventional generation, but that their costs are more fixed and predictable compared to fossil fuels. And another noteworthy point that we can take away from this graph is that natural gas peaker plants, so that's that top bar on the conventional generation. So natural gas peaker plants, which kick on when demand on the grid is at its highest, have the greatest sensitivity to fuel cost out of the types of conventional generation shown here, which means that as we continue to put more and more demand on the grid, from things like data centers and just basic population growth, it will become even more important to invest in peak shaving technologies and behaviors like battery storage and demand response, like we discussed last time. So we're kind of in this situation where the solution to high natural gas prices is renewables and demand response behaviors. The natural gas prices in the US are like are sawtoothed. So they're highly variable, and they will naturally rise over time as we deplete all the easy to mine natural gas sources.
Well, I think one of the other things to mention too is I think maybe some of the thoughts from the audience might be like, hey, well, the Middle East, like they're building all these amazing things and they have so much wealth with all the oil they have and all that. And I challenge people to look into where the Middle East is primarily actually getting their energy from. And interestingly enough, a lot of their energy is generated with renewables, and they are in fact exporting their oil. So they're actually already kind of a little bit ahead of us on that, in that they are actually building an infrastructure of renewables, realizing that, hey, we can power everything this way. We can make more money right now on the oil if we just export it rather than using it, because everybody else is seemingly still using it, and we'll just build the infrastructure over here. And so the thought process being like, they're even looking to equalize their fuel cost, and they have more control over it than we do necessarily. And so when you also look at some of the finance side of things, and that's one of the exciting things that we get to do, is like on a lot of the projects, we're looking at the utility rates from before, for like 10, 20 years before, to 10, 20 years in the future. And when you look at those utility escalations based on those fuel costs, based on the infrastructure, based on all those, it is a wildly variable line. And I think people would be okay with an increase in costs from time to time on anything. But when it's variable, you can't plan that. Like as a business owner, as a consumer, you can't plan for that. Like to suddenly get smacked with a bill that you just didn't see coming, you have zero control over. It's really hard to actually know how to navigate going forward. And what kind of renewables enable is this semi-flatlined generation and usage curve that, of course, economically makes so much sense in the long term, but also makes more predictable day to day of how you're able to manage your economics, your finance, your energy. I mean, all of it becomes a lot more predictable. And that's what I also like about this graph, is that whole top part is very predictable. There's not a lot of variance in there.
Yep. Yeah. And that takes us perfectly to the next slide, but I'm going to pause for 1 second just to jump back to, the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia as an oil producing country. You can you could say like this is kind of the best case scenario for an oil rich country, is to sell all of their fossil fuels to other countries and take the money and invest in better technologies for themselves, renewables. But you also have to look at like what kind of impact has this had on on the Middle East as a whole, or like on Saudi Arabia as a country, it's produced a massive wealth gap, which
Mm-hmm.
just naturally leads to societal instability. It's
Mm-hmm.
produced, people that have way too much money, more money than they
Mm-hmm.
could spend in 100 lifetimes. And you have people that are in absolute, destitute poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's an antisocial outcome. So even into the best case scenario of like a country deciding, we're going to do something better than fossil fuels. We're just going to use them to make money to pay for, these better improvements. It still produces some pretty radically antisocial outcomes. So I just wanted to,
Yeah, definitely.
to make
Well,
that point.
And I think that's a really good thing to add too, is like, it kind of goes back to that idea of like natural physics. It's like you have an input and you have an output. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. So like you're going to have a positive and a negative, and it's knowing what those are and trying to keep them as level as possible, rather than increasing that positive and the negative. I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to.
Yeah, always be aware of what you're compromising. Life is nothing but a series of compromises. And the most important thing that you can do is be aware of the pros and cons of your decisions. So, and that's writ even more large for countries. So, next graph is the sensitivity to cost of capital. So this is basically, it's a little more busy than the previous ones, but essentially it shows the price sensitivity of different generation sources under different economic conditions. So those are listed at the bottom. So it's kind of going from better economy to worse economy as you go from left to right. So we've got at the bottom the rate of return on investment. That's the after-tax IRR WACC. That's the rate of return on investment that's possible. And then the cost of equity, which is the rate of return to investors. And then the cost of debt, which is the interest rate. So if you go from left to right and look like what is changing the most and what is changing the least as economic conditions change, you can see right at the top, nuclear, gas peaker plants, and coal are all just the most expensive across the board, and they also have the highest increases as economic conditions worsen. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have onshore wind and utility solar laying flat at the very bottom. They didn't include commercial and industrial solar in here, but it will be somewhere around there. So as the economy, continues to slump, as we've seen in the last 8 or so months, nuclear will eventually become the most expensive type of energy in the country. And it will be neck and neck with natural gas peaker plants that are used to keep the grid from collapsing as we put more demand on it. And then coal, of course, will be a bigger and bigger cost sink for the federal efforts to revive it as a viable energy source. And what is the least sensitive to economic swings? Renewables. So not only are renewables cheaper, quicker to build and bring online, and overall more pro-social, but they're also kind of recession-proof, which means that an investment in renewables is a pretty safe bet regardless of what's happening in the economy.
Well, and I also wanted to add here, I love this graph because it really does, like if you stare at it long enough, it really gets a lot of info in your brain. Of course, I'd like to point out that like gas combined cycle is third on there, which it is actually great. It survives pretty well. However, wind and solar PV are even better. And so that's that crossover point that we were talking about. It's like, yes, it is still efficient, and we're not saying that it's not. However, this newer technology is even more efficient, and then there's more knock-on benefits, and it's a better investment, better economics. It's like, that's the kind of data where it's like, that I think makes a lot of sense, especially from an investor side or a consumer side, is like, but the alternative that I've been used to is still good. And it's like, yes, but if we're always striving to be better, here it is right here. And like, here's all the data.
Yeah. If you want a safe investment that you're going to get a high rate of return on, no matter what the economic conditions are, you need to go renewable. There's, that's kind of the go-to play. So yeah, and yeah, this is just a snapshot of what prices are like this year. So next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, you have to imagine, these lines kind of sorting out even more, as fossil fuel supplies, continue to decrease, and renewable technologies continue to improve and come down in cost. Like these trends are going to get even more significant.
Well, and you have
So
this really, really thirsty industry of artificial intelligence on energy. It's extremely thirsty, and some of the big players, the Microsofts of the world, like they don't have enough energy to even plug in their GPUs. And like when you're that needing of energy from a business level, that's not even the consumer level. Like if you think about that load going over one way versus the other, like so now suddenly the consumer doesn't really have energy. So like you have this inherent need for more energy for advancements in all things, whether it be technology, manufacturing. I mean, literally every single sector is dependent upon energy. And I think it is one of the biggest opportunities for, I think in a lifetime, literally in a lifetime, to be involved in an industry that will literally change the world. Like energy is going to do that. And we're at this crazy inflection point where it will power most of the innovation of the world. And what I've been noticing is that the most intelligent investors and the most intelligent people are putting a lot of focus into energy right now. Like we're seeing it a lot more in the news, of course, and a lot of people are like, oh, energy, energy, energy. But that means it's been a topic for quite some time. And so it's this thing that I think a lot of people overlook, but it's like we turn our light switch on every day. We're recording this podcast. Like all of this is reliant upon energy. And so like this moment, I think, is such an incredible opportunity to not only get educated around energy, but realize that there's actual opportunity here, especially when there's need. I think a lot of people, when there's a stress or a fear, there's also opportunity, and it's opportunity to make things better. It's opportunity to improve. This is that opportunity right now. And that's incredible.
Yes. Yeah. And that leads very nicely to our final graph, which shows the price of energy sources over time. So again, this one is a little busy, so, forgive me, but what I really want to focus in on here, if you go to the very top left corner, that yellow line, that is solar. That is the price of solar. And so back in 2009, not even that long ago, 2009, it was the highest, the most expensive type of energy generation in the country. Now look at it. It's in the bottom right corner, which means it is the lowest cost, which means that, to get back to like my very first point, that the tax credits have done their job. This graph shows that they have done their job. The price is down. It's way, 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 way down. And this is the price without the tax credits being involved. That's how they did this calculation. So the tax credits have really done a great job at dramatically reducing the cost of solar and, to a lesser extent, the cost of wind and geothermal. Another important point here is that conventional technologies are essentially flatlined in terms of cost reduction, with the exception of nuclear, which has gotten more expensive over the last 15 years. So while the prices of all forms of generation have been relatively stable over the last 5 years, minus a small price hike related to the pandemic and now spiking energy demands, renewable technologies all have new developments on the horizon that will lower prices even more. So things like perovskite solar panels, floating offshore wind farms, enhanced geothermal technologies, and solid state batteries. All of those things are like right on the horizon for renewables. And if you look on the horizon for most conventional generation sources, there's basically nothing. With nuclear, you have the potential for small modular reactors, but we've talked about those before, and there's a lot of hurdles that those need to clear before they can be as common as like a wind farm or something like that. There's
Mm-hmm.
the use of radioactive materials just immediately adds a ton more roadblocks to development, because it's dangerous. It's
Mm-hmm.
so we need to make sure that we're doing it in a safe way. So both in the past and in the future, we can see price reductions with renewables that conventional generation sources just cannot compete with. They are not
Mm-hmm.
competing with it. And then beyond just the cost, renewable technologies, which I'll include energy storage here, offer other advantages that we've talked about before: resiliency, predictability, stability, huge health and climate benefits, and totally new types of revenue generation and innovation opportunities that can be taken advantage of by just about anybody relatively easily. So yeah, I like this graph a lot, because I mean, you look at what has gone down and what has not gone down, and
Mm-hmm.
you can very clearly see, like, okay, well, these ones are going to get
Clearly have
cheaper.
a potential.
These ones are maybe going to get more expensive, or at least they're not going to, they're not going to get cheaper. We'll end our little slideshow there, but just to recap real quick,
Mm-hmm.
we first saw that renewables are the cheapest type of generation available,
Mm-hmm.
and they offer unique advantages that extend just beyond just simple price points. We saw that the ending of the federal tax credit for renewables will, yes, cause a minority of projects to no longer pencil out as well as they did, but that those will be in relatively small amount. We also saw that the way in which these tax credits are being ended by the federal government are going to hit those in high need energy communities hardest, which is unfortunate, and something that I think we kind of collectively can help step up to the plate there. And then we saw that conventional generation sources like natural gas and coal plants are quite sensitive to fluctuations in fuel prices, and so have unpredictable energy costs, which is something that renewables have zero issue with. They have zero fuel costs and zero sensitivity to them. And in particular, natural gas peaker plants are the most sensitive to fuel prices, which means that what is currently the most expensive type of energy that we have, natural gas peaker plants, will continue to get more expensive as we put more demand on the grid and use up more of our easy natural gas sources. So some of my background is in ecology and evolutionary biology. And sometimes there are some pretty fascinating parallels between ecology and industry. And there's kind of this whole branch of study now called industrial ecology, which, I mean, it's for this reason. So when I'm looking at this, what I'm seeing is the competition between two species, two populations. One is a species that can make more efficient use of its resources while creating less waste, degrade its habitat at a far lower rate, and reproduce faster than the other species in the ecosystem. And we would consider that, in evolutionary biology, to be a more fit species, which is that, it's adapted better to the conditions that it lives in. And we would expect it to naturally outcompete and replace the other less adapted species, barring, an outside influence like a meteor or something. And so not that there's a exact one-to-one between biological ecology and industrial ecology, but the underlying principles here, I think, are true, which is that by taking a chunk of our collective economic output and feeding it back into a worse technology and a worse method of producing energy, our fitness as a society is diminished, and we are put at greater risk of economic harm and being outcompeted by countries that actually have or are adapting to the conditions of the modern world. But this really just gives us a chance to show off how much we've learned and grown, and to go even faster and even further than we could before. So, not to be too cliche, but there really is a huge opportunity in this crisis. And I'm it's kind of like we're standing on the top of the wave, and we're gonna ride this thing down. So yeah,
let's ride it. Well, John, thank you. This has been a fantastic episode. Hopefully it was helpful for everybody else. And until next episode, it's Power to the People. Thanks, John.
All right.
Energy is inherently a part of everything we do in our lives, but one of the least understood things.
I can see a future where there is limitless and free energy. And that's a pretty beautiful world to live in.